Welcome to everyone attending today. Tonight concludes our Distinguished Speaker Series for the 23-24 season, and we are so pleased to have Steve Clemons visiting us once again after I think it's been about 3 years. So I'm Karen Burkhart. I am the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. Let me take a moment to thank our sponsors and our supporters, the Richard Petrus Foundation, the Clemons Foundation, also to our institutional members, the El Pomar Foundation, the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak State College, Colorado College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, Seva Charter High School, and Fountain Valley School. And I'm very happy to say that we have a table full of UCCS representatives here today. And we also have an entire table of Fountain Valley School. So welcome, and we will be looking to you for questions. I'd like to invite our mission support coordinator, Maren Carson, up for a brief announcement about our DLP program.
A little pause, we would appreciate it. That's okay. I am a mission support coordinator for the World Affairs Council, which is mostly just programming, the events, and a little bit of the international visitor programming. And we actually have 3 exciting home hospitality opportunities available in the month of June. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this concept, we often allow members of the council to host international delegates in their home that comes through the Springs through this international visitor program. As a great opportunity for you all to share your favorite meal with them, give them a little taste of American hospitality, and just enjoy the natural cross-cultural connections that occur through these exchanges. The first group will be a delegation from Morocco. They will be in town the 1st and 2nd of June. These will all be Saturdays and Sundays, so you can kind of determine which one works better for you. The next delegation is from Japan. They'll be here the 15th and 16th of June. 16th is my birthday. And the final group is actually 13 delegates from 13 different countries. You don't have to host all of them. If you don't want to, we can still come up. But they will be here June 29th and 30th. So if you have any questions about this, or if you would like to get involved, you can contact either Terry, who's the manager of our International Visitor Program, or myself. And we have our cards out front too if you want to ask questions and you can't catch me at the end. Thank you.
On your table, speaking of Morocco, we need just 2 people. And I know that my friend Hillary Dusing, who's sitting right over here, stand up. You would have a chance to travel to Morocco with Hillary Dusing, and I don't know how you can pass that up. We need just 2 more people. So I know that there's 2 people out there, and so bring your friends, and we will all go to Morocco together. So let me, with that, introduce tonight's speaker. We have the distinct pleasure of hosting Steve Clemons. Steve is the founding editor at large at Semafor. He spent 3 years as editor-at-large of The Hill, and before that was Washington editor-at-large of The Atlantic, and editor-in-chief at AtlanticLIVE, the magazine's live event series. Steve is also the host of The Bottom Line that airs on Global Network, Al Jazeera English. He also publishes the political blog at the Washington Note. Is that still current?
Yep.
Okay, Washington Note, and was previously CEO of the multi-arts program, the Bebop Channel. He is a former staff member of Senator Jeff Phelan, served as director of the American Strategy Program at the New American Foundation, and former director of the Japan Policy Research Institute. So please help me to welcome Steve Clemons.
Thank you very much. Hopefully this is working, and I think it is. There we go. Yeah, it is so great to be back. I just wanted to start and first off say thank you to all of you, because I think this is my 4th or 5th journey here. I think they, usually don't tell the whole membership I'm coming because they don't want me to go stale with all of you. And so, but it's been a great pleasure, and it's great to see so many of you, and we're going to have I think a fun and interesting conversation. I started coming here, and I just want to say a tribute to my friend Sky Forster and his wife Janet. Many of you know Sky. Sky had a health issue. We have like a little "You're the Best" thing to sign here. I've signed it. I hope this will go around the room. We should all give Sky Forster, because I think this is all on video here, a round of applause for all the dedication he has given. Sky adopted me in Pittsburgh. And he would go over, and I would tell him, I'm looking at, tell me the name of your school again. Fountain Valley School. So I love that Fountain Valley School is. I know there are young people over here as well, because Sky Forster in Pittsburgh had this thing. How many students? 1,500 students? Crazy number of students. And every year he would sort of shame me into going to Pittsburgh and spending a lot of time with these students, which ended up being very enjoyable. But I was one of these kind of uppity people that said, I don't have much time. But it proved to be one of the, I think, most important. I'm still in touch with, from decades ago, some of the students I met in Pittsburgh. And I really want to commend those World Affairs Councils that take time to instill the notion about why engagement in the world, why hosting international visitors, why traveling abroad matters, because that's very much at risk today, and it's going to be one of the conversations I get into. I will warn you that I'm a ferociously independent guy. I went to Washington many, many years ago as the first executive director of the Richard Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom, whose name was, thank God, it was changed to the Center for the National Interest. But I wasn't a Republican, but I used to hang out with that crowd. Then I went to work for a Democratic Senator, Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico. We were just talking to Lisa down here about New Mexico and did that. And I've been an independent all my life. But I do want to forewarn you that yesterday evening I spoke in Denver. And in Denver, John Krieger, who's the executive director, went up there, was so happy. He had a great, great crowd. I met everybody, said hello. No one said anything nasty to me personally. But to him, a couple of the most liberal members went up to him and says, God, I can't believe you brought a Trumpy here. Some of the conservatives say, I can't believe you brought, Rachel Maddow's pal here or something. So he was thrilled to have a very balanced perspective in the audience, because I think that this, people have, big views, and I sort of thought that we would talk about the election, what's going on in foreign policy and everything. And it's a hard conversation for me. I don't have fixed views. I mean, today I did a pre-interview for a big global security forum that I'm attending in Doha next week, and I interviewed Robert O'Brien, who was President Trump's national security advisor, just a few hours ago, in fact, in the offices of the World Affairs Council here. And Ambassador O'Brien, gave me a picture of Donald Trump's views of the world and of Russia, and of standing strong against Russia, that I rarely hear from Donald Trump himself. So, sometimes, truth is a negotiation, between a lot of people weighing in. And so I have that tomorrow. I'm interviewing the president of Rwanda remotely, Paul Kagame, about some things going on in Africa, also on global security issues and whatnot. And then I just did a few minutes ago, we were talking, Rob Dubois is here. Rob, raise your hand. Old friend of mine who used to be a regular attendee at the New America Foundation, a think tank I co-founded, and one of my really good pals, Peter Bergen, who was CNN's longtime terrorism analyst. Peter has, found bin Laden in 1997 when the CIA couldn't, interviewed him, and is one of the country's leading terrorism analysts. And terrorism wasn't even on my list to talk about tonight, but Peter just sent me a note that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's still in Guantanamo, may be brought after 20 some odd years for a pretrial hearing in New York. And so it's when you think about the frames, and I start this way because our frames about what foreign policy is or national security issues changes like waves at the beach. We were all obsessed, and I remember coming and talking to all of you about terrorism, how to approach terrorism, how to think about terrorism, what were the real, big emerging issues that we were not seeing because we might be blinded by some of our concerns about terror. Terrorism is now off the radar screen, and a lot of other things are, now it's China, now it's others. A few years ago when I was here, and I remember with Sky, we would kind of do, tell everybody that a map is, and we just pay attention. How long am I going? 6:45?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Maybe 6:40. I want to get to all of you too. But with the issues of people's mental maps matter of what they think, how they think about the world. And I used to come in and say, okay, let's go on a tour de force around the world. Let's talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about China. Let's talk about Russia. What does Europe look like to the United States? Does NATO have a purpose anymore? I mean, these were the kinds of questions that we would all discuss at various points. And as you sort of look at that, it was a geographic-driven map. What are America's national interests in nuclear proliferation, in oil and energy? It was a very different map. If you think about that, and I've kind of created a different way to think about global issues, although I'm happy to talk about China, Russia, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, any of that you'd like to get into, and will. But I think that the way, to sort of, put a 3.0 or 4.0 version on foreign policy and politics, now we're just thinking about things in much more transnational ways. Climate is an issue that cuts across borders, and the way in which climate and thinking about climate, thinking about the refugees from climate, violent weather, what we do, what are the appropriate responses, and what are the national industrial or national economic plans around climate, and are other countries cooperating? That's one area that needs a lot of attention, and it's one that, particularly when you think about this battle, which is very predictable now, we know Joe Biden really, really, really well, and we know Donald Trump really, really well. There are not going to be a lot of surprises, I think, in them. Although I was surprised by Robert O'Brien's impression of Donald Trump, but that's another story. And Robert O'Brien, if you don't know, runs a good chance of being Secretary of State or back as National Security Advisor or perhaps head of the CIA. He'll be in the establishment of Donald Trump's foreign policy elite at some point, and that's why talking to him is important to kind of get a take. But we'll get to that in a moment. But in climate is an issue that in the Biden team and to a lot of Democrats has sort of ascended as a significant issue and has probably descended among Republicans and among those that have watched with great alarm. Let's put this over here. You guys want to sign this to Sky? Good. Send it around. But what's that? Huh? Okay. Oh, I was muted. I thought it was loud. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did you guys hear anything I said? Oh, okay. Let's start over. My apologies. Did you hear anything about O'Brien or okay. So nice to be with all of you. But if we go back to the map, the climate issue is an important one because it is an issue when you wrestle with another element of climate connected to it is energy. And we used to look at oil, gas, coal, and renewables as sort of a linear thing. We were moving from some to renewables and kind of moving along. And then Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, cut off gas supplies to not only Ukraine but also to other states in Europe, and weaponized energy and weaponized energy flows. Weaponizing energy flows changes the game when you begin thinking about how you move, how quickly you move to renewables, and how does renewables fit in. So we're going to have renewables. We're moving that direction, but there's no way we can move fast enough to deal with the demand and energy we need, and particularly when a good section of the world is deciding not to cooperate and be aligned with what I would call, generally, civilized behavior. So climate and energy are tied together, and Donald Trump does not prioritize the climate part of the equation and does prioritize the energy part of the equation. I think the Joe Biden team honestly looks at it very differently. So climate is one of these. Finance and trade. Today, President Biden issued orders to triple the level of tariffs on EV cars. And so they've gone to 100% tariffs. We've gone in solar panels to 50%. I think EVs, EVs are 100%. There's something at 75% in there. But essentially, the infrastructure, some medical supplies, also aluminum, but there was a review of Donald Trump's sanctions on China, and they've kind of focused on this area that are important strategic industries to the United States in this green energy transition, so again, coming back to climate, but looking at what industrial policies in the United States are really important for that. This is a very new and different thing because it raises a really interesting and important question. Wow, is this about jobs? Is it about this, or wouldn't it be good? I mean, the other side of the climate equation, would it be good if China sold all those cheap EV vehicles all around the world and promoted even in the United States? So there are trade-offs, and I wanted to put that out there that to some degree we're going to get to China, but the whole issue of strategic competition and predatory targeting of industries, which China has been a master at for a long time, is not a new thing. I mean, I was on Yahoo News just a little while ago talking about this and saying, wow, it's just like we woke up and decided to put these sanctions and said, well, China's doing this. Well, they've been doing it for decades without not much response from the United States. Donald Trump sort of changed the ante a little bit, and now we're doubling down and doing a lot more. But it's an interesting tension between whether the real cause is, the real goal are jobs and having technology come back, and whether manufacturing will really return to the United States in these areas, or whether China, which controls about 80% of the critical materials, that's another transnational item to think about, is where are critical minerals today that can be mined? Not, I mean, maybe in Colorado Springs you guys are a little bit more pro-mining, I'm not sure, but the permitting problems and challenges of domestic mining inside the United States for lithium and whatnot, and the other precious metals needed for green energy transition, it's very hard. It takes decades to actually open up mines in the United States for this area. So we go to Africa, go to Canada, we go to Australia, but Africa is a place that China's been investing in for 2 decades. So this is another strategic question in industry where when you begin looking at it, we're focusing on it. There is, in fact, a lot of attention. There's a global infrastructure partnership plan, which is our response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Nobody's heard of the Global Infrastructure Partnership Project, but we're trying to brand it better so that there is some awareness. But in that arena, it's another arena where, right now, I think Donald Trump, when you kind of think about what he's thinking about in terms of what to do, I think that is an arena that did actually start, some pieces of it started during the Trump administration. So there's continuity between Trump and Biden, and you think about it, that will probably continue. So what you see is some areas between Biden and Trump and thinking about the election. Some of these areas that are not really geographic anymore, but they deal with technology. You think about AI, I made a long list here. Chips and EVs, critical materials, AI and next generation technology. The whole arena of these things are the way power is going to be distributed and pursued in the future. But in the middle of this, messing up my plan and my map as I'm talking to all of you of these transnational issues, the Ukraine-Russia war looks like an old World War II style war. Those things weren't supposed to happen anymore. Some of you may recall, I mean, I had parents and grandparents who had memories of World War II, even World War I. Those memories among many of the young people here, you don't know necessarily unless you have very good linear histories that have come down to you, how devastating those conflicts were for many parts of, for societies around the world and also for the United States, the pressure, the change, the transition, the organization and focus on manufacturing. And many people wonder whether we still have that ability to endure it, because we kind of cocooned ourselves away from the harshest parts of conflict and war. And we saw that in Afghanistan and even Iraq, that even though we had significant deployments there, America did not. These became casual wars on the side, almost forgotten wars. It's very, very different for Ukraine today, which I'll get into a bit further. But we have old-style wars coming back. And it's made me think a lot about Trump and Biden and the difference between them in foreign policy and the people who sort of follow them. Donald Trump prides himself on being someone who never started a war, never engaged in a war. He did fire some rockets. They were polite strikes that had very little damage in Syria. I called them polite strikes when I wrote about them. We've been engaged in other conflicts where, with Joe Biden and troops deployed, it's been there. That's not to say that Joe Biden is pro-war and Donald Trump is not, but there's something about Donald Trump that does not like deploying forces abroad in conflict because he fears where it might go. It's just tied into his DNA, the way he thinks. There's a lot of bluster, and he's willing to try to find a lot, even with ripping up the Iran deal, even with the bluster of raiding weapons down on North Korea before he became very good buddies with Kim Jong-un. I think that there are different dimensions there where he looks at these wars and conflict as black holes for power, for money, for assets, and it's the way he's wired to think. Joe Biden is in a very different contrast. He's someone who was, on the Foreign Relations Committee forever, chaired it, was ranking member, was Vice President of the United States, probably one of the most knowledgeable vice presidents in foreign policy and foreign affairs. He handled, because Barack Obama got very tired of the Iraq portfolio, and I remember writing about the Biden doctrine when he was VP, when I was at the Atlantic magazine, and wrote about his stewardship of the Iraq portfolio, which the president didn't want to do, Hillary Clinton didn't want to touch it, nobody wanted to do the weekly Iraq meetings, and so Joe Biden kind of turned lemons into lemonade in that case and began carrying that portfolio for a long time. And honestly, it was very impressive to me because the detail that Biden brought to trying to resolve certain internal tensions inside Iraq was impressive to me. But when you sort of look at that, he has a sense of the way the world was. But he's defined by a guy who remembers the Cold War. Do you folks teach? You teacher? Are you the teacher?
No, but I have time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, but the question is, I mean, thinking about the Cold War, I think a lot of people generationally and spatially in their minds don't remember the Cold War. So something like Russia, which is of course derivative of the Soviet Union, invading Ukraine, feels and means something different to young people who have no memory of that than a Joe Biden who has a lot of memory and looks at NATO and Europe and Eastern Europe and and NATO expansion and all of those issues, largely still within the muscle memory and the PTSD of the Cold War. But a lot of younger people don't. And same thing with Israel-Gaza. When you look at Israel-Gaza and the long legacy of actions in each way on the Israel-Palestine standoff and the kind of relations with the Middle East, and we can get into that. We've not had any Gaza protests here yet, but you're welcome to if you'd like. But in the process of thinking about this again, there are generational divides, and it's one of the things when you look at the election and you look at what's happening. The biggest red light I think that is blaring for the Democrats right now is a generational apathy about Joe Biden's foreign policy choices right now. They feel as if they're tied to a different era, tied to a different set of equities. They don't understand why the Palestinian crisis isn't really a social justice equation that's obvious to them, even though the attack on October 7th, the death of 1,200 Israelis, the taking of hostages, all of these issues was such a horrible, horrible moment, and the reaction that you can be on both sides of that debate today and still hopefully have a civil discussion that you don't want to see a lot of innocent people killed on either side. But it comes down to these binary questions. You're either all in or all out. I'm of the view that there are lots of shades of gray. And I think that right now we have an American public that is confused about some of those dimensions, and I'm happy to talk about all of that. But we've seen college protests that largely are people saying, hey, we might not vote for Joe Biden. This may be one of the first elections where foreign policy actually does impact. Usually foreign policy is on the sidelines. It's not a big deal. It is usually kitchen table dynamics, kitchen table economics, inflation. There are concerns about the southern border and immigration. And a lot of that is driving Donald Trump's popularity right now in contrast to Trump. And these are all, mostly, they involve international issues as well. So the southern border, migration, wrecked economies and horrible situation driving people north, plus the power of the U.S. economy that is basically a magnet for a lot of folks. And the problem has gotten genuinely worse. And the policy responses to it have not been, efficacious in basically lightening the load of those people trying to apply for asylum or figuring out what to do. So that's an issue for Democrats, for Republicans, and it's very hard to get away. But that is definitely on the minds of many Americans. So is inflation. I'm sure it is on the minds of many of you that inflation and what happened here, the costs of things have made whoever is in the White House look like they're not controlling the price of meat or peanut butter or eggs or milk or whatever it may be that they're buying and watching the prices grow. We're going to McDonald's or Starbucks, and all of a sudden that muffin and coffee, is now over $10. Something along those lines is something that's really impacted people. And I told my friends in the Biden administration early on when they came in, show the difference, show how you can do things in economics, and to respond to the supply chain crisis, which many people have a memory of. They couldn't get their washers and dryers and, various components for things and building homes or whatever. They got cars were crazy. All of those issues were, part of the supply chain crisis. And I said, right now, Donald Trump laid out a huge, huge swath of sanctions on China. Just give them a holiday. Suspend them for 2 or 3 years. If you suspend them for 2 or 3 years, you'll basically bring inflation down a few points. You'll start things down a different. You'll solve the supply chain crisis in the short term. And then you can bring them back once the economy has begun to. We're doing $750 billion of trade with us. I didn't win that battle. We just kept the sanctions on. And a lot of Americans paid the price of higher prices. China still did well anyway because it continued to basically dump product around the world. Nothing was changed by way of behaviors over there, but it did create a populism dynamic in the United States that is rising with people who are very frustrated that they think the United States government is not responding to their needs and that somehow is coming undone. And it's in that space that Trump and Biden are trying to fight it out. And it's in that space, it's very frustrating to me as a voter who cares about democracy, that basically 5 or 6 battleground states are going to decide that election. Most of the rest of this largely don't matter. I'm sorry, Colorado's probably pretty predictable. And then when you look at it, it's really not Republicans or Democrats who are going to decide it either. It's basically a third, which is independents. And if you get out and you look at those independents right now, it's a toss-up, you know, in terms of who will gun it, what's animating them. And there are a lot of issues on the table. And foreign policy is one part of it, economics is another part of it, crime is part of it, immigration is part of it, abortion politics is a huge part of it. And in that, you've got 2 political franchises, the Biden franchise and the Trump franchise, fighting over this space to kind of convince Americans that they're a better deal than the other one. And what I think is really, really interesting in this case, this is before we've gone through that overall map. Add on that, Xi Jinping probably wakes up every morning asking his team, what are you delivering for me in AI? And how are we going to beat them in AI? And how is AI going to become our new tool, our new weapon, our new competitive secret sauce to move it? The focus, you know, my friend Ian Bremmer, many of you know Ian Bremmer, probably hear his work, does an extraordinary job. He says, Xi Jinping wakes up every day with a super high priority on artificial intelligence, on quantum, on building up all the assets, intellectual, and all the frameworks and investment he can. We're beginning to, and we have strong assets in the United States. And right here in Colorado, I was just talking to somebody that Cray Computer was based here. You've got NORAD, somebody who's basically going to do an internship. We have incredible assets right in this space, but that doesn't translate easily into a coherent national strategy and policy. We're trying to do that now with things like the CHIPS Act, with the tariffs and barriers that have come in to try to restore a sense that science, investment in science, and basically creating incentives for the government and industry to cooperate across strategic technology partnerships may give us that muscle again to compete with China, because China is very, very focused on this. So I mention all these kind of transnational things because then you got to go back to the old map. China's trying to basically undermine American dominance in just about everywhere, but not necessarily have its clash with us. Taiwan is definitely something that's part of the national ticket of Xi Jinping's focus on rule and authority. And I think that is something that you can imagine some train wrecks and some kinetic collisions and some really deep things. When you kind of look at how the world is watching, what is China doing? What is the United States doing? How is the world behaving when we want to kind of tie the world up because of the bad behavior of Iran or the bad behavior of Russia? Guess what? The world is not entirely following the United States. They're hedging their bets. And the hedging of bets, it's like probably one of the most important things that I think I'll convey tonight, is we have to be very careful about hubris, whether it's under Trump or it's under Biden. And hubris is a sign that we just think because America has decided that someone is immoral and over the line, that we're going to have the world following along us and isolating that bad player in the world. Nations are hedging their bets. Brazil is hedging its bets. India is hedging its bets. The UAE, which is a great ally and friend of us in many ways, is the one bringing Russia into many Middle Eastern countries that's hedging its bets. The Saudis are now, we're flirting with the Saudis a lot, despite the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and Mohammed bin Salman. The Crown Prince is a complicated character, to say the least. But we're going there because they began flirting with China. And to basically take them back into our camp, we're now going to do some deals on nuclear issues, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy issues, and others to try to keep them from falling back. So that geostrategic competition with China is going to become a defining element on top of all these other stress points. Russia is definitely surprising the world by being able to withstand sanctions. Its economy is doing fine, relatively fine. It's found different solutions to kind of get around a lot of the problems we tried to set up for it, and is continuing through disinformation and cyber sabotage and others to destabilize the countries that used to be part of its so-called sphere of influence. We just saw this in a member of Europe, Slovakia, where Slovakia basically just elected a government with the Prime Minister Fico and a new president. They have split between head of state and head of government, who are both essentially tilting pro-Russian, and look at those people who want to support Ukraine as warmongers. And this has been something that's been generated inside a European nation, and it's really, it's a point of concern depending on how you see the Russian-Ukraine thing. I don't want to presume all of you, but the destabilization, the disinformation elements of this is another side, and a significant portion, not all of it, but a significant portion of that capacity is today coming from Russia. And I look at the United States side of this and say, well, Joe Biden is trying to basically raise alarm bells about it, but a significant portion, and I know many of you are conservatives and Republicans, I would not say this is of all of you, but there is both a dovish wing of the GOP on Russia, that, I'll call it the Tucker Carlson crowd, that look at Russia and having many redeeming values, and Russian leadership is having redeeming values. Robert O'Brien, the former National Security Advisor to President Trump, said that President Trump sees what a threat Vladimir Putin is, would stand strong, did stand strong, and looks at Joe Biden's side of the Joe Biden speech about Ukraine, saying, we hope that they basically don't go for all of Ukraine, but maybe this part. And they looked at that as green light. He has an interesting and important point. But he's basically, and I pushed him on it, I said, you're painting a picture of Donald Trump being a hawk on Russia, but it's something that that I had never seen before, had not seen that element in their behavior. So these are the kinds of divides and choices that we're all looking at in terms of the leadership. I think another element, and I'm going to be honest about my concerns, because I think there's a good chance that Donald Trump may come back as President of the United States. I think that it's going to change the system if that happens. There may be good elements. He definitely was discontinuous on trade. He got us to think a little bit more about our economic interests in ways that we had not done before. I would put that as a net positive. I think Joe Biden has continued many of those policies. The net negative is I really care about expertise in government. I care about public policy experts and state intelligence and others, and I worry a little bit about the battles between these institutions ending up with basically people who look at things all through a political lens becoming the determinants of how public policy is shaped. That sounds a lot like the old Soviet Union with political commissars that were telling the Farm Bureau what its output numbers were. Or, I know somebody's here in the space program, et cetera, you can begin thinking about whether you're having successes or failures. To my mind, rationality, objectivity, the Enlightenment, critical thinking need to be the biggest drivers of the professional service that serve the government. They should be apolitical, serving Republicans and Democrats, but there's more and more of an effort to capture people in those jobs and places. And I think there's no doubt that to some degree, I would even say that the far left of the Democratic Party is in a similar place where they also want to control those people and capture them. And we have to basically have a national discussion about it. But when it comes to the foreign policy side of it, the biggest issue is there are a lot of Americans who don't feel like being engaged in the world, what you students are learning, pays off for them. They saw, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 1980s, that being engaged in the world somehow worked for the American middle class. You kind of felt there was a benefit to it, that the reserve currency status of the dollar, that trade, that American leadership in the world, being the security guarantor of the world, somehow made us safer, made our economy better, and gave us privileges globally that a lot of other nations didn't enjoy. Now, my family's from Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and if you go to Oklahoma, it's a nice little smart little town, filled with petroleum and all this, but I always go back to Bartlesville to kind of check in with what people are really thinking. And I have to tell you, the 2008, 2009 financial crisis really hurt them. Really, really hurt them. And they felt, in the way the parties were sorting themselves out, kind of left behind and demeaned. They saw 5,000 people at bailed out financial firms after that financial crisis get more than $1 million a year bonuses as they were drowning in their home mortgages. And so that inequity was something that I think really hit a lot of people. Many people who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan lost jobs, came back to not having the jobs. My brother was one of these people who, was laid off 3 times by Hewlett-Packard and couldn't take it anymore and became a nurse. He's a great nurse, and he got through it. But the point is that the social and psychological trauma that many people felt, like having generations of sort of soldiers and nurses and people that had dedicated themselves to the country in various ways, were somehow getting lost in the mix. And who was rising? China. We saw offshoring of jobs to go to China. This was a palpable thing that Donald Trump, the rich playboy billionaire from Queens, somehow got the language right and had it right in a way that captured the imagination and the enthusiasm of about 35% of the American public. And if you have a passionate 35% of the American public, you can do a lot. It's not a majority, but it definitely gets you over the edge. And when you kind of then take that into a party, where you're able to basically take over a political party, you can rearrange things. And Donald Trump, someday, there are going to be fascinating books written about how he grabbed the political party and disrupted the direction of the nation in many, many ways. I think some of them good, some of them not good. Definitely when it comes to race, identity, and whatnot. But the biggest thing that's underlying underneath, which is my biggest message, is isolationism is on the ballot, right? I won't say that Donald Trump is an isolationist, but a lot of the people who do support him, who are not here tonight, because they look at engagement in being in the world as not being in American interest. I know a ton of Republican, I'm friends with tons of Republican senators and Republican House members that think the absolute antithesis of that American power is based upon being a leader and being engaged in the world, being a good place, being a good power in the world of that sort. But there are a lot of people who feel like the equation doesn't work for us, and they feel as if being withdrawn from a lot of this is better in the long run. This is what you hear from Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's what you hear from Matt Gaetz, it's what you hear from a number of people, I think, at the broad side. And I think it's a real, in my view, personal view, it's a real mistake. That said, those that do believe in international engagement, need to become less sloppy about it. They've got to be able to go to the American public and talk about why being engaged matters to them, and basically remind people, the German Marshall Fund, and I know there's a tape going here, so I'll be very careful. The German Marshall Fund, the leadership there is going around the country trying to assert to communities that being engaged in the world matters for them, and they should, because of patriotism and because of America's place in the world, because of the spirit of America's leadership and whatnot, do that. But I don't think that's enough. I think you have to go to people who feel like they lost their jobs, don't see the benefits coming back, to be reminded that there's a strength in that engagement that we're going to translate. This is what gets me back to what just happened today with trade, economic issues, climate, the national policies around ships. This is trying to connect, in my view, those kinds of leadership back to reinvigorating a sense that being engaged in all of these issues is going to pay off for Americans, and it's going to leave us with a better future than we would otherwise have. That's the link. It's just there are very, very few people in my book who can communicate that effectively. President Biden is not doing so effectively. He didn't talk about Ukraine with the nation. I told them, and I have a lot of friends in Biden land, and I said to his chief of staff, former chief of staff, have the president go out and have a conversation with a country like FDR did about sacrifice, about what was needed. Tell them about why this is an important issue. Create the historical context. But there was pressure and tension, political tension, where the view was if they did that, if the president owned that conversation so robustly, it would offend perhaps Senator Mitch McConnell, who was also bringing the Republicans to support what was going on with Ukraine and our investment in Ukraine. Mike McCall, the chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, who's a great person, cares about these issues, but they didn't want this to become politicized, so they didn't see it appropriate in that early stage for the president to have a conversation. I just say that's baloney. They should have done it as the president of the United States, do it in a way that talks to all Americans, not to one side or the other. So those are the dimensions of this debate, which are really, really important, because we have a NATO summit coming up in July in Washington, D.C. And I don't know who thought it was smart to have a NATO summit in Washington, D.C. a few months before an election. But believe me, I mean, if Donald Trump's advisors aren't there saying, hey, one, I got these NATO nations that kick in more resources and money, so that's another thing that he can take credit for, and I actually think he did a service getting European nations to recognize that they had to pay more. But that said, his threat to NATO is always, I'll leave it, if they're not there. So that the fragility of America's place with the Article 5 and the strength of probably the most successful alliance in world history is a fragile one. And I think that for political reasons, it was insane to have a NATO summit in Washington that Donald Trump is going to run against, out there campaigning against what all of the strategic elites and the strategic crowd are doing to undermine Americans' interests, elevating this concern and question about whether being engaged with the rest of the world pays off or not. And so I worry a lot about that NATO summit. It's one of the other items I said, again, thinking about maps and what issues, that's another big issue that's part of the equation here. So I have stopped giving warm and fuzzy speeches. I have, you know, when I think about it, my TV show and the various commentary I've done, I sort of like to have honest conversations with how I see it. I write a column for Semafor called Provocations, and I like to provoke people. I like to hear what you think. I like to hear your counter views. Some of you may not agree with the way I frame things, but I don't think it does us any good to have rah-rah discussions that pretend that there aren't serious tectonic issues both inside the United States. I have a lot of respect for my Admiral Mike Mullen, who's a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In every new administration, they come in and they're required by law to write something called the National Security Strategy of the nation and to set forth a strategy. I think it's every 4 years. Some of you may have been involved in writing it, and you may know more about it than I do. But you know, when Mike Mullen was there and the National Security Strategy came out, half of that report, for the first time in its history, was dedicated to the dysfunction and poor performance of the U.S. economy. Inequality, the retreat of manufacturing out of the United States, the way in which America was less and less the brain drain problem for the rest of the world. American success was based on bringing smart people to this country, some of them staying and sticking and some of them going off somewhere else with some of the stuff they learned here. I think going back to 9/11 and a lot of other security issues has made it harder and harder for talent to easily get into the United States, come back to the United States, and we see this all the time. We have chips right now. I know a lot of the Korean companies that are coming into the United States, SK Group, Samsung, others, TSMC, which is coming from Taiwan, with tax dollar supported incentives to help build a semiconductor industry. They can't easily get their engineers and trainers in the United States. So when you've got this crazy thing, you've got industrial policy saying, hey, we want to do this, we're going to get billions of dollars, we're breaking ground, we're building facilities, but the people and the knowledge they have in their head from these companies that are paying this can't easily get in the United States and deal with that. So we have an inconsistency in this. And I think that's why when, you know, again, I don't want to generalize about the Trump administration, because I do believe that there were many in the Trump administration equally worried about the solvency of the U.S. national economy, but they're much more skeptical that talent abroad, companies abroad, investment from abroad matters. They have a view that somehow, if you put up larger walls around the U.S., that somehow we can sort it out, organize ourselves by detaching ourselves and the expense from a lot of the roles that we played in the rest of the world. That's one part of the GOP. It's not all of it by any means, and I would never presume it is shared by those of you here. The Biden side, and I mentioned this last night in Denver, was, who's the guy holding up the world, struggling to hold up the world, Greek mythology? Atlas, okay. Like Atlas struggling. Atlas always seemed to be stronger than I'm imagining him to be in this image. But trying to hold everything as it was, knowing in his mind and his map, trying to hold all of that together, and then responding in a whack-a-mole way. My critique, friendly critique of Obama and Joe Biden, who had incredible intellectuals around them, Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, we have Bill Burns at the CIA, who I think is the Henry Kissinger of this moment. Why aren't they the Dean Achesons of today? Why aren't they rewiring the global social contract in the world so that there's less misalignment between the UN and the WTO and various international institutions and the way power is distributed? Brazil and India don't feel like they have much of a place in these international institutions. And so when you're out there, if you're the United States and you hold enormous power in these institutions, the IMF, World Bank, we just had a set of meetings in Washington, and you can sort of feel the frustration of the rest of the world with the incumbency and the unwillingness to sort of redraw the lines of power. And I've long advocated America should be the secretariat of it and the chief architect of this new next phase, and we will get the credit for it and be seen as the nation and the leadership that delivered a very... That would be a great alternative, but Joe Biden and his team are not doing that. I saw Jake Sullivan the other night, and I said, I keep dreaming of you hopefully becoming Dean Acheson too. And he cringes. But it's one of the things there. And that's why a lot of people who support President Trump say it's not worth it. Let's just pull back. Let's organize. And I want to tell all of you, as I finish this comments, would love to hear from you, you need to take that seriously because it's potent. That view may come into power. And it's something that I think we need conversations with our neighbors and people to come back to this notion about why being involved in the World Affairs Council matters. Why students in high school and in colleges engaged in knowledge of the world matters. and why ultimately we have to get back to understanding that somehow we need to reinvent ourselves nationally and economically in a way that propels us forward in a various way. That's what this election is going to be about. And I think you're going to see right now it is a toss-up between those two different visions. And in American politics, you're not getting a stale choice where both choices are largely alike. They're very, very unlike. And the visions that are largely behind them run alike. With the one exception of Robert O'Brien, whom I interviewed this morning, who's confused me a little bit, because he makes Donald Trump sound a little bit more hawkish than Joe Biden. I'm happy to send in the video of that next week to anybody who wants it. But let me stop there. I would love to hear questions, comments, challenges, anything you like. But thanks so much for listening. Yes, sir. And tell us who you are. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Yeah. Hey.
Question for you.
Sure.
Biden administration policy toward Iraq. You mentioned it here very briefly.
Yeah.
For example, he's following the Obama administration regarding nuclear weapons for Iran. He's also, has done very little to solve what the Iranians are doing with the Houthis, with the Hamas, and with Hezbollah. And also, the Biden administration said that there was a red line with Iran attacking Israel. All three of those are there. How do you explain what's going on and where is it going?
So it's a great, great question. It's a little murkier, I would argue, than you may have framed it. But the broader point is, if you circle Iran and say Iran is a problem case, and I think this is what both the Bush administration, Bush and Cheney had done before, and others had looked at the Iran as this and said, how do we organize and bring the world around? It's a hard problem because Iran has allies. Iran has issues. It's also a huge country and with assets. And so the world is, how do you attack it? How do you take it down? How do you contain it in a way that doesn't create other huge problems globally in the world because it's a major oil producer, et cetera. So they've always hedged their bets on Iran. I'm just going to be honest with you from my perspective. And I think when Obama came in, and you sound like somebody who's probably not a fan of the JCPOA, but Obama was of the view that Netanyahu in Israel was going to make a strategic choice for the United States by bombing Iran and its nuclear energy facilities, as they were calling them at the time, and draw the United States into a direct war with Iran. And there was a lot of allergic reaction to that formula. So the JCPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, essentially came about as the alternative to what they saw as a likely war with Iran. We got in place. What's interesting is, to be honest about it, whether you think the Iranians are ethical, moral, not engaging, we actually chose not to do a grand bargain with them. We did this very focused deal. I think that was likely a political mistake, not looking at the behavior of their proxies, not looking at ICBM development, not ballistic missile development, not looking at a lot of other issues. But during the Bush administration, they had walked away from a grand bargain approach. So both sides have been played whack-a-mole on this arena. Iran is a really, really big problem in the world. And the red line that you mentioned about Israel and the direct attack on Israel was made murky because of Israel's attack on a consulate, which technically is sovereign territory of Iran. So the escalation of that was predictable. What I'm amazed by, knowing Prime Minister Netanyahu, knowing this, is that largely got capped off somewhat politely by everybody working behind the scenes with Israel, whatever. But has it solved the Iran problem? No. But what you haven't seen is a massive escalation up. You have seen with the Houthis, again, what are the Houthis? Are the Houthis authentically part of the Yemen establishment, or are they simply a proxy of Iran? It's a big question, back and forth. The big point is, we don't have enough talent, and we don't have enough assets trying to figure out how carrots and sticks can solve these problems. And if anything, the region has become much, much murkier and worse. Now, what the Trump administration tried to do, and I credit them with doing it, is they launched the Abraham Accords to try to find normalization strategies with Israel And I think the Saudis were getting pretty close until October 7th happened. So October 7th and the actions of Hamas, and I'll tell you, I have absolutely no evidence at all, but the biggest beneficiary of what happened on October 7th was Russia. And I say that because Russia and Ukraine fell off the front pages of the papers. Ukraine became a secondary priority. Israel and its security became a primary concern. And one of the biggest coups that would have been the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Israel is a true superpower in the Middle East. And to have that alliance there would have been the best thing to curtail Iran's expansion there. So what Hamas did, despite the horror, was strategically brilliant in undermining what the West did. What my disappointment with the Biden administration thus far that was working on this is not to figure out how do we have a summit, how do we not deal with the people that put together the Abraham Accords to define that as the best strategy to contain Iran, right? So I share your frustration probably less severely than you articulated than this, but there is just a mess. I mean, there's a mess in a lot of parts of the world, not just there. There's a mess and an inchoateness in how we're approaching this about what our equities are. And so I'm sorry to go on so long, but I agree with you halfway. How's that? A coward way. No. Yeah. Hi, we have a student here.
Hi. Okay, I have two questions that kind of go together.
Okay.
You hold it close to your.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I have them written down. How do we get citizens to want to join this global conversation again and kind of get more people to interact with it? And do you think it has to do with a lack of pride of being an American that forces people?
Say that one more time.
Do you think it has to do with a lack of pride of being an American that people, I said,
Sorry, I did not see that step. I wasn't trying to interrupt your question. Slapstick here.
Sorry. I'll say it. How do we get citizens to want to join in the global conversation again? And do you think that a lack of pride in being an American is influencing people's decision to not be a part of the global conversation?
So, thank you for your question. I honestly don't think that many Americans, there are exceptions here, let's just face it, there's exceptions to everything I've said tonight, and I think it's very important as you young people are looking, there are exceptions everywhere. Part of being critical thinking is listening to someone, finding what you agree with, what you disagree with, thinking about that. I don't think there are many Americans in my experience that are not proud of being Americans. So I think there are different versions of patriotism, and different forces shape this. Now, I'm not going to be an apologist for which an apologist means someone who's just going to accept the most nefarious sides of that. But American identity is very complex. You know, it's complex socioeconomically, complex regionally. I told you I'm from Bartlesville, Oklahoma. I hang around with a lot of people that were from the kind of northeastern liberal Ivy League establishment. It's a different world I don't know. But that I'm a more rare person in Washington in that sense. You've got people who have experienced, communities of color that have, experienced bigotry, problems along the way. And a lot of this is in this melting pot of the United States right now, and it is complicated. And there are winners and losers in it. And the biggest change that I've seen in my decades of experience in public policy is the biggest failure is how America has not figured out how to return to a system where largely it's what's called civitas. Civitas is this notion that there is a vigorous struggle over policy, over politics, over where the country's going. There are going to be winners and losers in that, but everybody realizes they're on the same boat. They're not going to sink each other. There's become a zero-sum game between constituents in Washington that think, well, in the nation, that think if one group wins, they will automatically lose and somehow, be left behind, demeaned. I remember, there are many Democrat friends in this room. I did an interview with then Vice President Biden in 2016. It was on the record for the Atlantic, and he said that the problem with the Democrats, this is him saying this, on the record saying this, was it had become a party of snobs. It was a very insightful comment, because when you looked at that time, if you agreed it or thought it was right, that there had grown a disregard in some of the leadership of the Democratic Party about the needs of people that were in pain, that had lost homes, that may have found this, which is also part of it. And I'll just say it: the white working class American was feeling left behind by a lot of what was going on, and that's what Donald Trump was able to pick up. If Biden had run in 2016, I think he would have won because he would have authentically channeled some of that Donald Trump picked up. So I want to come back to this point about Americans not being proud of it. I think that there are just contending views of what it takes, what they feel the country should be about. Now that said, there are a lot of Americans, too many of them in my view, who think that Washington has screwed them over so badly for so long and has been irrelevant to their family's success and needs that they would like to see Washington disappear, to be strangled in the bathtub, as my friend Grover Norquist once said. That there is this real view that Donald Trump was supported by a lot of people, not because of his policy views, but because he was a wrecking ball. And there's a lot of support for that wrecking ball, and you have to understand, rather than having disdain for that, have to understand why they feel that. Because for the country to come back together, these different corners have to begin talking together. On your issue about talking about global engagement, is that what you call it, being engaged in international issues? I would endorse exactly what you said. We need to begin proactively engaging people on why it matters, why being internationally isolated or less culturally enriched is something that makes us small, that makes us irrelevant, that takes us out of having leverage in world affairs, that takes us out of having impact on key things. Remember, I started with this, the way the map had changed. Climate, technology, AI. If we come within our shores, we're not going to have a lot of power or ability to influence the way the world manages those things. And we'll become more of a victim than we will a problem solver if we don't engage people in those discussions. And so that, I feel very, very strongly, somehow that process has atrophied and become less robust. That's why I'm so, so happy to see young people like yourselves engaged in these discussions, or what Sky Forster did in Pittsburgh. But there is still not enough in some ways, and there's still a lot of distrust. Trust is a big part of societies. Trusting that you think at the end of the day, they're largely going to be driven, your leadership is not going to be corrupt, you're largely, even if you don't agree with everything, you sort of largely trust the impulses. There is very, very little trust between those that strongly support Joe Biden and those that strongly support Donald Trump. I don't know how to solve that. Maybe we just, they're both lame ducks the moment either one of them wins. Maybe we just have to go to Canada for 4 years. I don't know. But the point is but I think, look, I think there's a really interesting challenge here, and it gets a lot of my liberal friends very upset when I say this. Donald Trump is willing to muscularly attack the status quo in ways I have never seen a U.S. president do. And maybe when things are broken and you need to rethink things and trust is low, maybe that challenge is going to shock the system into behaving better. I have to tell you that I have almost no progressive or liberal friends that agree with me. They think that Donald Trump is going to be a fascist who's elected into office. Madeleine Albright used to say fascists are elected as something there. I don't quite agree with that. I look at the American political system as being stronger than people think. I think Donald Trump is going to he's probably going to have a divided Congress, and I don't think the courts are going to disappear overnight or automatically controlled. But I do think he's a disruptive force in a way that we haven't seen anyone. And it bothers people that somebody can be that disruptive and can come in. I think Joe Biden is in a way has done more than you can imagine with the infrastructure bill, with the CHIPS Act, with wiring economies and broadband, of doing a lot of these areas in the American Recovery Act. And it's surprising what he was able to accomplish and do. They're really crappy at marketing. I mean, no one knows what Joe Biden has done, and he's not getting much credit for it. And despite having 3% inflation today, you've had 27 months of unemployment under 4%, pretty remarkable. And they're just not talking about it. They're talking about saving democracy, and many of you may think saving democracy is important, but a lot of people want to figure out what to do with their kids, what to do with crime, what to do with immigration, what to do with kitchen table economics, and all of this stuff. And I keep telling Mike Donilon, who's very close to the president, Steve Ricchetti, other people, it's very important for you not to just talk about saving democracy, which is a platitude to a lot of people. You've got to kind of reach them where they really are as they're struggling in the economy. And even with good economic conditions in large part, they feel worried about the future. Remember, the stock market is prices are based on what you think they're going to be in the future. China, in many ways, has always got the premium on its power, not by how much power it had today, but how much power they think they're going to have in 10 years or 20 years. America right now needs to reinvent its mystique. It needs to kind of come back and tell the world, you know, we're the greatest nation in the world because we can reinvent technologically. We're the brain drain problem for the rest of the world. We're going to focus on AI. We're going to be the leader of these various issues and not fall into the game of being stuck in very classic and conventional ways of thinking about power. And if I may, my friendly critique of Joe Biden is that is where he is, and that's a problem for the country. So I have both very critical of both options coming up, and I really wish we had a different option than both tickets. Most Americans agree with me, but we don't get that choice at this point. So that's where I'm at. But anyway, great questions. Yes. Hi. Oh, we got one here in Georgia. Rob Dubois. I'll be less long-winded. The tiramisu is really good, by the way.
It is so good to see you again. We're so grateful to hear the reasonable, rational, responsible voice out of DC. It's not hard left or hard right, it's not like we were working together back there. My question is about contraction, about isolationism. You know, the Japanese tried it a few hundred years ago. It didn't work out so good because the whole world left them behind. And you know, I'm engaged with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition back in DC, Veterans for Smart Power.
Right.
If we do not contain or continue to engage, if we do not continue to be part of the world's community, what then? Because if we contract and say, hey, let's just do America for Americans, Iran and Russia and China, we are really, really ready to expand into that gap, right?
They are. I mean, I think that Rob, thank you. Look, I think, again, we're sitting with bases around here, NORAD next door, a national security aware crowd. And we have a lot of incredible strengths in the United States. In fact, we have so much strength and power that I don't think we actually realize how much strength and power we have. If you read Jeff Goldberg, my former colleague's interview with Obama, Obama's biggest worry is we didn't have purpose attached to this enormous intelligence and national security power. So that power sprawling all around the world was more hijackable by regional groups, diaspora groups, political groups in the US, around the world for their little pet projects here and there. And there was very little strategic consensus around what we should, you know, do with this power. I wrote a piece long ago, it was more than a decade ago, saying that the world believed America was strategically contracting. And then I said, rather than looking at our enemies, the filling void, watch the behavior of allies or close partners. And I picked 4 countries to evaluate. One was Japan and Germany, so 2 World War II rivals who we beat into pulverine, you know, into dust, pulverized. And you look at the choices they were making a decade ago, they were both making choices that seemed odd given how close they were to the United States. Germany was rejecting some of the things that we were putting forward. Japan was hedging its bets in various ways. And the other 2 countries I picked a decade ago were Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? So 2 rivals in the Middle East, both of which were very, very close to the United States. And you could see how the behavior of these 2 nations was changing, and particularly the Saudis, beginning to hedge in different ways. And you saw in Israel, essentially, a comfort with politicizing part of their support of the U.S. in a way that I think put them at risk. But it's because they worried that, in fact, they were vulnerable. And I think when you have allies that are worried and vulnerable, they began to change. And I think America has got to, as part of its plan, figuring out how it takes USGLC, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, its aid, its engagement, and refocuses with consciousness and deliberateness what it's going to do. So my friendly critique of USGLC and all the stuff we're out there is that it's inchoate. And the inchoateness translates into, to Americans who don't understand this world, is what are we getting out of it? What they see we're getting out of it is some other nation is getting the market, right? You know, right now in the critical minerals space, you know, I have friends at the Exim Bank, and the chairwoman of the Exim Bank right now is Rita Jo Lewis. She's very, very impressive, but she's tied together with the Development Finance Corporation, which is tied up with the State Department, the National Security Council, you know, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, and trying to figure out how America rolls the dice better on taking a bigger stance on critical materials and minerals and metals, which it needs. And I think they're doing it. But part of the thing they have to do is they have to fund development in Kenya. Or they have to fund development. And so there are critics about this saying, why are you doing that when we have so many needs in America? And we have to have an answer for that, Rob. And I don't think that we have had very, very good answers for it. And the truth is, even during the Trump administration, because I don't think Donald Trump is a full isolationist at all. I think Trump wants to do deals. I think he'd do a deal with Iran tomorrow if he saw a good way that it benefited his group. I think, and I told this to a Saudi group last week, a very important Saudi people. I said, you're all kind of feeling a little confident about it, but I said, Donald Trump would have done a deal with Rouhani if they'd been able to move 2 or 3 little pegs, right? And so you've got to understand, and come back to this gentleman's question, you know, I think Donald Trump once sees himself, Donald Trump sees himself as a major historical player. And he will, like Nixon went to China, wants to be Trump went to Iran. Now, there are a lot of things in the way of that happening, but don't have confidence in any continuity from Donald Trump on any of these countries. If he can do a deal, he'll do a deal. And he'll flip things on their head, and he'll want a Trump chapter of that. But I think in the USGL stuff, which I'm really happy you mentioned it, what's missing, Rob, is basically, again, a rewriting of that social contract, why it matters, a playbook, and a little story by Steve Clemons about why it matters that all Americans could read. That would be nice.
Good word.
Yeah, okay, good. Did you have a question?
Oh, actually, sorry.
Oh, yeah, hi.
Hi.
You guys are all being very patient. I'm trying to be less long-winded, but
Okay, this is very
I'm having fun.
Well, you actually kind of answered my question.
Okay, good.
My question was about isolationism. So you talked about that a little bit with Trump. I believe it's a facade, as you just stated, and so I'm wondering, basically also believe it's a facade in order to reunite and to reinforce his supporters and also to then bring in prospective supporters as well to his side, because what's going on in the world. So to state that he's isolationist is really attractive to a lot of people, but then once he's potentially in office again, then to, you know, he has his friends closer and he's closer, right? So they're, of course he's not fully isolationist, so I'm just curious what your opinion is on that.
And you're talking about Trump, because I didn't...
Yes.
Yeah. So the truth is, I've never heard Donald Trump say he's an isolationist, so it's important to keep that in mind. But there are a lot of people who tilt towards isolationism that want to support him and think that the disregard that being engaged in the rest of the world doesn't pay off. What Donald Trump wants to do is to show that his engagement with these challenges, whether it's NATO, whether it's the NAFTA, which he turned into the U.S.-Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, etc., those kinds of renegotiations and deals, he wants to show that his influence, his negotiating ability has changed the game and done it. He has a very, very high bar. Very, very high bar, higher in many ways than he's given credit for any deployment of U.S. forces or any military. He just doesn't like it. It's something that Robert O'Brien did emphasize about not wanting to do this. He sees a lot of other, and he's not given credit for that. Maybe that's the wrong thing, and maybe that undermines the perception of American power in the world. But to your point about the isolationist dimension, I think John Bolton. I mean, many of you remember that my blog, The Washington Note, launched a 21-month campaign to keep John Bolton from getting confirmed as the United Nations ambassador. He never got confirmed, and he blames my blog. But we have since become friends. It shows that magnanimity and keeping an open aperture is probably a good thing in Washington. And so I've done 5 or 6 interviews. I actually talk to John Bolton about every month now. And John Bolton is someone who has publicly said he's worried about creeping isolationism in the Republican Party, and he's working hard to fight against it. So can you imagine a guy that my complaints about John Bolton being a pugnacious nationalist in 2004, 2005, have now been replaced by this international champion, John Bolton, today, basically trying to do what I'm advising all of you do, talk to your neighbors. He's going to senators, from one after the other in the GOP, and House members, doing what I hope other Americans do, which is to talk about the critical importance of American leadership in the world and what matters and what doesn't. John and I don't always agree on everything, but I tremendously admire him for being willing to do that. So I use John Bolton as the gauge about his own concern. He's in a wing, what I used to call a radical wing of the Republican Party and foreign policy, but there are more radical wings, which he is worried about growing. So I think that the important thing to think about political leaders, and I'll end this here because I don't want to, about this question, I don't want to overgeneralize about President Trump and to say he's something when he may be different. people, I heard him one day talking about the southern border when he was running the first time, say 3 different things in 3 different cities in 3 different days. And nobody really held him to account, you know. So you have to understand that politicians, whether we like it or not, are not always coming with a pre-baked frame. I know that Donald Trump is pre-baked on trade. He really does not like trade. He thinks it undermines American interests. It's deeply inside him. He really does not like wars. He thinks wars are bad for business, bad for him. So there are certain elements within his DNA and his behavior. But when you kind of look broadly at how he's surfing these waves to try to become president, people can say and do things that they may not be deep, and they may. I remember when John Kerry was running against Obama. Mitt Romney. They seem like Mitt Romney, John Kerry. But when Mitt Romney, they were both talking about, you know, day one coming out and bashing China as a currency manipulator. It may sound like a small thing now, but at the time it was a big deal. They were both talking about it. Day one came along, nothing happened. But it was a central part of the battle between Romney and Obama that disappeared later. So I would say that as I'm kind of talking about these issues that I think are undergirding this election, some are going to rise because of the election, and then some are going to, fall, fall later depending on it. But that wing, that isolationist wing, which has always been in American politics, probably 8, 9, 10%, probably grown and been fluffed up to be about 18% right now, which is a worrisome number. It's interesting that RFK has about, Robert F. Kennedy has about 18% of the vote, but I used to say this, 18% of New Mexicans, look, my friend Lisa's moved here for a minute, but 18% of New Mexicans used to really, really believe in UFOs, and there were parking lot spaces for UFOs in Roswell, New Mexico, when I worked for the state of New Mexico. And now we actually have UFOs apparently around, according to the Pentagon. So it used to be a joke, but now they're here. But I think that you have to understand that rising percentage means you're going to see some behaviors from Trump do that. But when he gets into office, I don't necessarily see him pulling out of NATO on day one. I see him arguing with these allies for a tougher deal. Donald Trump's style is to shake down friends, to kick in more in our alliances and relationships. And he may be colorful, he may even be obsequious to the world's villains, but he's trying to find a way around to change some of those. I'm not sure I admire that, but I think it's important that we observe it and understand that it's a way that is different than many other leaders. And that, as a journalist who has views and opinions, I still try to be objective when I see these and trying to talk about them. Because if I walk into a room and just bash Donald Trump left and right, that does the country no good. It just simply says, you're basically taking half the room as your hostage, and you're leaving the other half of the room, basically floundering, and it's just not the right way in these conversations and talks. So I try very hard to think through what's animating the politics on both sides. And my biggest worry is, I think that the conditions in the United States, we haven't gotten to a lot of the domestic stuff. I worry about the rise of political violence in this country on both sides, honestly. I mean, I got booed off the stage. I interviewed Joe Manchin, and we had a very scary group come up and protest my interview with Joe Manchin. We were doing a thing on permitting reform that included both Democrats, congressmen, Republican congressmen, that include the fossil fuel industry, and it included the renewables industry. It was a fair and square conference, but this group, Climate Defiance, came up and circled us. And it's probably the angriest I've ever been in something, because we were circled and I was worried about the senator's security that I was there. Our security was crappy because we didn't expect this. But that was a group allegedly on the left that's been protesting the White House, John Podesta, and I'm like going, who do you think is going to be better? I mean, you're not. I mean, the Republicans in this, I would call them the energy realists, are not in their target. So you've got a lot of things going on right now in this tumult where all the sides are not listening to one another, and I'm trying to promote listening.
We have time for 2 more, and
Okay.
one of them.
She's been trying really hard. Okay.
Yes. So I just have a couple of questions.
Okay.
I don't know about it. I respect a lot of the ideas we talked about. And I know what I think is maybe not a statement or a question. So that as an American citizen, I think we should have choices. And I know you like to advance technology, to get into electrical cars, take away our gas bills and everything. And there's stuff in America where we want our gas dogs. We don't want you to take that away from us because, yeah, we want to continue to move forward in this. No, I mean, I think we should have choices. This is why America is what it was, coming from an immigrant family here, right? And what they came here for, and how they fought, and how they worked so hard for what they have, not taking a penny from the government. You know,
So I agree with you, we should have choices.
Exactly. So this is what I'm saying, when all these governors and all these lawmakers are putting up laws there that now you can have a gas law, now you can have a gas law.
Right.
So truly, I like the moving forward, having a conversation. I lived in Europe for quite a long time too.
Okay, so come to the question.
And so that's it. The question is, do you think that Joe Biden is cognitively stable to run a race as the president? I mean, he doesn't even allow people to ask questions from the press or anything, and even to even speak about Ukraine or anything else that you mentioned.
My fingers are crossed that he and Donald Trump are both cognitively stable enough for this election. Look, it's a really weird election. I've traveled all the world with President Biden. If you know stuff about me, if you've gone to a deep dive, you know that I knew Beau Biden very well, Hunter Biden, Kathleen Biden, Hunter's ex-wife. Very, very close. And so, yeah, anybody that knows Joe Biden sees that there have been changes we would see, but I'm not an ageist, and I try to be very respectful of the fact that we're not just electing a man in this case, a man or a woman. There are no women yet in this, although Kamala Harris, of course, is in there. We'll see who comes in as a VP candidate. But in the president choices, you're dealing with franchises and not just individuals. Now that individual needs to stay alive, not fall, not trip, not have a stroke, not have a lot of things, you know, during a very vigorous campaign. The last campaign he ran, he really ran from his basement in Delaware. It's a big, big difference in change. I have seen President Biden. I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I thought he did okay. I didn't think he did great. I think that right now, for those who believe in the Democratic vision and who have concern about Donald Trump coming back, and I want to say that's a very authentic and deep view that a lot of people feel, right now, the way things are baked, that's their choice. Unless something tragic happens between now and then, which I would never say it would happen. That's there. But I can tell you that David Rubenstein, who's a very wealthy, patriotic philanthropist, Carlyle Group, donated to basically restore the Lincoln Memorial, Washington Memorial, all of this stuff, was in the Carter administration. He regularly says, I mean, I can't pretend it's off the record because he says it in enough places that people would report it, that he sort of feels like it's the Carter administration convinced it was really going to wallop Reagan. And that there's this feeling inside the White House and the Democratic camp that things are good, that it's great that Biden is an underdog right now, and that he'll be like Silky Sullivan in the road horse races, and he'll come back and and take him. So I don't know. We'll have to see what happens. But Rubenstein also makes the point that said nobody, if President Biden finishes his next term, if he were to be elected, he'll be 86 years old, and no one who hears that can think about that number 86 without worrying and thinking about who that vice president who might become president, who's a heartbeat away from the presidency. And in that case, I have to tell you that all the controversies about Biden, everything I've said about, identity and race and gender and, places in the world and what we're doing gets even more complex when you bring in a character like Vice President Kamala Harris, who's not that well known by the American public. I mean, she's been on the ticket for a long time, but there's very little awareness of her capacity, what she succeeded in. We hear rumors that a lot of her staff don't like working for her. Maybe that's true, maybe that's untrue. It's an issue, and we don't know who Donald Trump's 77 years old. He's going to be 78 soon, and in that case, things happen. He's a big guy, he's running around. He wears his age right now well and better than President Biden is wearing his age. But that said, it doesn't mean that something couldn't happen on that ticket as well. These are the two oldest people to run for President of the United States in our history, and in that, you're also going to look very carefully at who that I guess it's not going to be Kristi Noem. I just don't know. What was she thinking? What was she thinking? If you watch the interviews with her, it's remarkable. The best thing, who was it? Who's our friend? I'm having a senior moment. The senator from Alabama, Julia. Senator Britton, I think, who came out, and there was a lot of joking about the style and her response to the State of the Union address. She was saved by Christie. Nobody remembers that anymore. So in any case, whether it's Tim Scott with J.D. Vance, with there's sort of this competition right now going on as you can go up to the court in New York and put in the time and the benches. There's going to be someone who comes along with President Trump, and these same questions are going to be asked, and I think they're going to be complex for people. So I really respect your notions about choice. I am frustrated that President Biden hasn't done more press and media as well. I completely concur. And I am someone, whether it was under the Trump administration or the Obama administration. The Obama administration was horrible, in my view, to journalists and press. They began the harassment and the threats towards press over the leaks of secrets. My friend Jim Risen of the New York Times was taunted in unbelievable ways. And so I just want to say that oftentimes you divide and think who has black hats and white hats. They all have gray hats. And there are different shades of gray in this. But when you come to journalism and what journalism is under siege around the world, and in my view, the behavior that was initiated in part was always been bad around the world, but some of the behaviors and the treatment and the disdain for the press and journalists demonstrated by the White House, whether it's President Biden not doing interviews or President Trump and some of the comments that he made. But that said, President Trump calls journalists constantly, all the time. You think Maggie Haberman finds all that stuff on her own? No. Donald Trump is giving it to her. He wants to be the Shakespearean tragic figure in the Maggie Haberman story. So it's a really complex mess. I mean, I wish Shakespeare were alive to make that really a lot of fun. So anyway, thank you. We have one more question, right? Or are we done? Oh, one more. Okay. Thank you all for being so patient, by the way.
Hi. So I'm also from Oklahoma, and I know that.
Which city?
Edmond.
It's okay.
Heard that joke a lot. So I was wondering, knowing that Oklahoma is a very oil and gas run state, I'm wondering how you think we can do a transition from this energy to more reliable energies, how we can do that in an easier transition and with a little amount of economic struggle. And as well as, how do you think social media can positively or negatively affect the upcoming and future elections?
So on the first one, remember every state, red, blue, whatever, essentially the divide is 60-40. If it's 60% Republican, it's 40% Democrat. If it's a blue state, it's 60, a strong blue state, it's 60% Democrat, 40% Republican. You have a huge number of people on both sides of the aisle, and they're usually represented in some way in towns, cities, the state legislatures, which we haven't discussed. So don't think that the blocks of, a political perspective are just one way or the other. Oklahoma, like New Mexico, like Colorado. Colorado's a mixed state, when it comes to energy. It's both a renewable powerhouse, but it's also a fossil powerhouse. And I think, New Mexico is a mining state and an oil and gas state, as well as a renewable state. And I would tell you that a lot of the research and development done at the University of Oklahoma and OSU is in renewable energy. And ConocoPhillips is one of the biggest investors in, a lot of the big players that are oil and gas companies are also the biggest investors in new next generation technologies. We're buying them and trying to find those innovations because they see where the world is going. And they know that the world needs, for a lot of reasons, industry. We were talking last night to people, in Denver, in the metals industry. And metals industry is not something you can easily run with solar power. The density of power that you need is very, very different in that equation. The defense environment, I'm friends with a congressman from Norfolk, Virginia, where one of our biggest, shipping, production and manufacturing for the U.S. military is there. You can't do that on wind turbines, right? So you're going to have a mix of things for a long time. And as Dan Yergin, who's probably in my book, the world's most ingenious and brilliant analyst of energy trends and whatnot, all of these energy transition issues are going to coexist with fossils for a long time. And Oklahoma will have that too. You've seen it in Oklahoma, you see it in Kansas, lots of wind farms, right? You see them in Oklahoma. And you've got investment coming in from these various state places as well. Social media, why don't I come back next year and we can talk about that. But social media, look, social media, that's something I haven't gotten into because we didn't talk about TikTok, we didn't talk about China, we didn't talk about the deficits and insecurities and vulnerabilities that come with algorithms and the power of weaponized algorithms. It's a whole nother dimension I could have added next to climate and finance and trade. Weaponized algorithms and AI are something we're still trying to get our head around. There's not a great deal of policy literacy around them, but the potential implications of out-of-control algorithms or weaponized algorithms are very real. And my biggest concern, again, I'm not going to end this in a very pleasant way, was at dinner with Senator Mark Warner. I love Senator Mark Warner. I think he's a really, really good guy who is appreciated by his Republican colleagues. He's chairman of the Intelligence Committee now. And I said, look, with all your concerns about elections and Russian meddling and all of this stuff, why aren't we meddling in their elections? You know, the CIA used to be good at that, right? We used to invent organizations and create protest movements, and we were really good. I mean, all of these, we had spies that defected to Russia. There's a whole culture of meddling that America was deeply engaged in. And John Podesta, who's President Savage on Environment, was there, and Mark Warner was at the Italian ambassador's home, and they basically said, and I don't know if I fully believe them, but they basically said that intelligence reforms, and because the intelligence community in the covert ops area killed a few world leaders they shouldn't have killed, etc., that we reformed ourselves out of those skills. Right? And I think we need to bring those skills back. I think you're not going to get deterrence in the media space with disinformation until you can send a message to Vladimir Putin or to Xi Jinping or to the president of Iran or whoever is funding and creating these pods of disinformation farms that exist to create divides in American society or other democratic societies. You've got the only deterrence. We're just basically getting slapped in the face over and over again with no response, in my view. We have the ability, as Rob and others know, in our Cyber Command and our National Security Agency, to deliver knockout blows to their infrastructure, which we are loath to do. And we look at it as disproportionate response to a sort of small disinformation campaign. But a disinformation campaign successfully produced a populist wave in America that actually does undermine democracy and a lot of the things that and undermines the basic core that ties us together. Then I'm like, well, that's a national security emergency. And you've got to figure out how you're going to do it. So John Podesta left this dinner calling me First Strike Steve. So we'll just leave it there. Thank you all very much.
I think you probably have 2 of our globes already, and so I'm not going to make you take the third one too. I think
I'll love the last 2 so much.
So very much, yes. Headed to Talon tomorrow, so we will make it, put it in the suitcase. So tomorrow is the last Great Decision program.
Pandemic preparedness.
Pardon?
Pandemic preparedness.
Pandemic preparedness. And as I said, this is our last speaker series program. We will see you all again in August or September when we kick off again, and have a wonderful summer. Thank you.
Thank you.